Thank you very much for accepting to offer this interview. We're very glad and honored. Shall we start with your family background as the first theme of this interview? Would you like to say a few things about your early years, early influences towards academic work, your family, your relatives?
Well, I had no family connection with Greece or the Greek world, and I certainly came from a supportive family, who realized that, my main academic interest was history. I remember being given for my 6th birthday a marvelous book called Our Island Story, and another book called Our Empire Story, because this was in 1946, and these books were extremely nationalistic, if you like, justifying the empire, and because the empire still more or less existed in 1946, and 2, 3, 4 years later it began to dissolve. But I had no interest in the Greek world. The only connection with the Greeks that I did have was that I was brought up in Sunderland, at that time a great centre of shipbuilding, British shipbuilding, and a very good friend of mine, his father ran one of these shipyards, and they would always ask me to attend the launches because they had a rather lavish reception and after the launch, and many of the people for whom these ships were being built were Greeks, in fact, and so I did meet a number of presumably very wealthy Greek ship owners, but without knowing anything about Greece. I think the only family I can remember was Mavrolion. I think I don't know whether they still exist as
there is.
Yeah,
and I remember they were famous for driving hard bargains with the shipbuilders, but it was a mutually worthwhile enterprise.
What about your education? Did you go to school where you were born, and then at the university? What did you study?
No, I didn't go to school where I was born. I went to a boarding school in Edinburgh, in Scotland, and I went to university in Scotland. And I must say, I think that sometimes strikes me now, as you know, where in Scotland there's going to be this referendum on independence later on this year, and it's when I was at school and university there, Scottish nationalism was a fringe subject. A few hardline nationalists, but no one took them seriously. But now the nationalist cause is a very serious one. I mean, whether they'll win the referendum or not, it has to be seen. But it's a serious movement, and the period between my time as a schoolboy and at university and today is about 50, 60 years, which is almost exactly the period in which the Greek national movement developed. 1770 to 1821, is the core of the movement. And I'm fascinated that it is the same kind of time scale. In 1770, not many Greeks were thinking in terms of independence, but by 1821, quite a lot were. And this is parallel in Scotland. So I was there. I didn't study ancient Greek. I had done a little bit of Greek, ancient Greek, at my prep school, as you call it, before I went to to this institution in Scotland, but I didn't continue with ancient Greek, which in many ways was a disadvantage, but in other ways was an advantage, because in my experience, many classicists simply have no interest in modern Greece.
Yes.
And you'll notice that one of my books is called A Concise History of Greece. And this is because in recent years I think we should drop the term modern Greece, modern Greek, or modern Greeks. So we don't use this epithet in connection with any other people or country in the world. I mean, we don't talk about modern Italians or modern Paraguayans or modern Paraguay. And so I wrote this book, A History, A Concise History of Greece, which begins more or less in about 1770. And I sometimes imagine that classics professors pick it up without looking at it and buy it, and then discover it's nothing to do with ancient Greece. But another example, I mean, I was latterly teaching at Oxford, and John Boardman wrote this excellent book called The Greeks. What was it? The Greeks Overseas. Anyway, it was the Greeks
Και το παράλογο,
overseas. But this was a history of the of Magna Graecia, you know, the Greek colonies of the ancient world. But you know, instead of a book called The Greeks Overseas, should be really about Greeks in Australia and Canada and USA and Germany or what have you.
In the modern times.
In modern times, yes. So I just
did you have any professors or teachers who actually influenced you in a particular way, or
not really. My serious interest in Greece developed in a rather odd way. A friend of mine at the university was taking a course in Byzantine art, and the professor there was a man called David Talbot Rice, one of the pioneers in the study of Byzantine art in Britain. And he, my friend Alan, had been asked by his professor whether he was interested in spending a couple of months during the summer vacation in Trebizond, in Trebizonda, working on uncovering frescoes in a 13th century Byzantine church. And my friend said, well, you know, would you be interested in coming along? And I thought, well, that sounds a fun way of spending the summer vacation.
when was that?
That was 1960.
1960.
And I must say, I was frankly bored by the work, which involved sitting on very rickety scaffolding in the church in very humid climate in Trebizond with a dental pick, the kind of thing dentists pick your teeth with, scraping off this plaster and whitewash that had been painted over the frescoes when it was turned into when the church of Hagia Sophia was turned into a mosque after the fall of Trebizond in 1461. And for about 10 minutes it was very exciting to see frescoes that no one had seen for 500 years or so. But, you know, after 10 minutes you would hardly have more than a pinhead to look at. And I thought for a brief time I might become an archaeologist, but I realized I didn't have the patience. to do for that. But although the work was rather boring, at the weekends we used to go exploring in the marvelous hills and mountains in the hinterland of Trebizond. It's an incredibly beautiful country. The town of Trebizond is a rather grim place, but the hinterland is fabulous. I mean, these very high mountains rising almost immediately up from the sea. And travelling around there in a Land Rover, we would see castles, Byzantine castles, churches, including the monastery of Panayasramala, which is, when we visited it in 1960, we were the only people there. It was a complete ruin. Now it's very much a tourist attraction in Turkey. So I began to realize that there had been many Greeks living in that area. I knew nothing about this when I went. And so I became interested in these recent Greek inhabitants of Pontus. Because after all, in 1960 was less than 40 years after the Greeks had been uprooted and evicted and moved to Greece. And so when I came back, I began to read more about this region, and then I did a little bit of Turkish and began to get a serious interest in this region. But there was no one really guiding me among my professors. I mean, many of them excellent people, but had no interest in this world, with the one exception of the man teaching me Turkish, a man called John Walsh, an American, who also taught my wife, Mary Jo, in fact, Islamic history. And it was a very small department, and that's how Mary Jo and I, in fact, met. I went to a seminar on the rock-cut churches of Cappadocia, and Mary Jo and I turned out to be the only two undergraduates there. There were a number of graduate students, faculty, and we were the only two undergraduates. And that was how we met. So I did some Turkish with Walsh, but he was one of these pupils of Wittek, Paul Wittek, this German, or possibly he might be an Austrian, Ottomanist, who was famous for his classes and seminars lasting 2 or 3 or 4 hours, and that turned out to be the case with John Walsh's efforts to teach me Turkish, and I simply couldn't devote that time to it, so I didn't make much progress with it. But I then when I graduated, I did get a postgraduate scholarship, and that was to study the Greeks of Asia Minor. It was far too ambitious a topic. I should have focused it much more narrowly, but I had to get no one to mentor me, and point out that this was a rather over-ambitious project. But I became particularly interested in the Karamanlides, the Turkish-speaking Greeks, and for whom there was a large literature printed in Turkish with Greek characters in the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries. And I did some work on them, and particularly on translations of the Bible into Carmen Lydica into Turkish with Greek characters, because I found a very rich collection of archival material in the British and Foreign Bible Society archives here in London. And they had an excellent library with some very interesting early editions in Carmen Lydica, which had been in the Bible more or less since it was founded in 1804 in excellent condition, whereas most literature in Carmen Lydica is in very poor state, being heavily used over the years. And in fact, one of my most treasured possessions is a copy of the last publication ever to be made in Carmen Lydica in Turkish, printed with Greek characters. And this was printed in Thessaloniki in 1929, because many of the Anatolian Greeks who came to Greece, and many of them, particularly the older ones, knew only Turkish, and women knew only Turkish in particular. And it was very difficult for them to get any grasp of Greek at all at their age. And this was a little pamphlet produced for these refugees, and it's incredibly rare. There are only 2 or 3 copies known anywhere, and I have one of them. It has no value, but it's of great philological interest, let's say. I mean, you can sometimes say you have the first book printed in German or French or English, but you can hardly ever say you have the last book printed in, not in a different language, but in a particular form of the language. So anyway, I was working on this kind of material in Athens. Major and I spent a year there at the British School, or the British School of Archaeology, as it's sometimes, but erroneously here.
That was just before the dictatorship.
Just before the dictatorship. Yes, yes.
You had also your first publications in Eranistis and
yes.
Δελτίο Κέντρου Μικρασιατικών Σπουδών.
Yeah, yes. And I worked in the Kentro Μικρασιατικών Σπουδών when it was in a small apartment, not in its very nice premises in the Plaka.
And you met also some Greek scholars like Dimaras or...
Yes, Dimaras was quite a mentor. He's a very nice and courteous gentleman, and he gave me a lot of his offprints, and it was partly under his influence that I became interested in the Enlightenment in the Greek world. But then we moved out to Athens. I think it was in September 1966, and of course this was a very troubled political time in Greece. Demonstration. I remember working in the Ethniki Bibliotheki there, and great shouts and from the demonstrators almost every evening outside. And someone else who was a great influence, husband and wife who were great influences on me at that time were Nikos Economidis and his wife Elizabeth Zachariadou, who were Byzantinis, and Veta Zachariadou had a particular interest in early Ottoman Byzantine relations, and I got to know them, and they began to explain various things about the political situation, which again I was in total ignorance of. I didn't really have much idea why Greeks were demonstrating almost daily, but they filled me in on it, and they were involved in a kind of a movement called the Omelos Alexandru Papanasasiou, and they invited me along to 2 or 3 of their sessions, and that I found that very interesting, and particularly because sometimes sort of right-wing hooligans would come in and try and sort of not exactly break it up, but shout and make themselves objectionable. And so I did begin to have some feeling for what was going on in Greece. And of course, quite a number of members of the Omelos Alexandru Papanasasiou, they became involved in Democratic Yamina. Under the junta, there was a fairly direct connection between the two. But then, things were getting more and more tense, and then in April 1967, the colonels took power, and we were staying in the British school. Mary Jo will remember this. Well, a notice went up on the door, on the day of the coup. You were not to leave the premises of the school, otherwise you may be shot. And that was an invitation to both of us to go out and explore Athens, which was a rather creepy experience because to begin with, the people out there buying food principally, but gradually as the hours wore on, fewer and fewer people on the streets. And we eventually returned to the school. And then another curious thing about that day was that in the afternoon of the 21st of April, 4 members of the staff of the British Embassy came out to play tennis on the tennis court. Well, at the time, quite a lot of people in Greece thought it wasn't so much Americans behind the coup, but British. And I would say, well, they're taking a very relaxed view of things, if that was the case, because they were busy playing tennis while everyone else was trying to work out what was going on. It might have been a very sophisticated effort to cover the tracks, but I very much doubt it. I think they were just more interested in tennis than in what was going on the streets of Athens. But having lived through a coup, I mean the only such coup in post-war Europe, it was very difficult not to want to know much more about it, and so I did.
You have published
on the dictatorship. And I did publish various things. One thing I did was I reviewed an excellent book in French called Vérité sur la Grèce. An excellent book, I thought. It was published anonymously, so I didn't know who the author was. And my review was published anonymously, because in those days the Times Literary Supplement never gave the names of reviewers. So I reviewed this anonymous book and said I thought it was a very good and balanced account of what was going on in Greece, and in particular the background to it. And then a publisher wrote to me, the care of the Times Literary Supplement, because the publisher didn't know who I was, because I was anonymous, and said, I'd like you to translate this book. So we did that. Major and I worked together on that translation. I would sit reading out a rough translation, and she would be typing it out. And then we did get to know the author, who was a Greek diplomat. He'd resigned from the diplomatic corps in protest of the colonel's Rhodus Rufus. Yes, and who was quite a literary figure. He wrote novels, and we translated the book, and we got to know him. And then I became friendly with someone, Greek teaching economics at the University of Reading, George Yiannopoulos, who was very much involved in anti-junta activities in London. And we co-edited a book called Greece Under Military Rule, with many of the... Yes,
until now
it's still valuable, I think.
Yes, important.
Yes, it did. And what was remarkable about it, most of the contributors were Greeks who were living in Greece and brave enough to put their own names to their article. Someone who did publish anonymously in it was, for very good reasons, it's the only anonymous contribution to it, was the Colonel's policies towards education. And this was written by Alexis Demaras, the son of Konstantinos. And poor Alexis, he died only recently. Last year. And he in fact became my first graduate student.
Really?
Although he was quite a lot older than me. And anyway, I then came back to England and had to find a job, and a temporary job in teaching European history came up at the University of Edinburgh, my old university.
Say about dictatorship.
Yes, and I met many of the Greek exiles who were in London at the time, Eleni Vlachou, Takis Lambrias, and Maria Caravia, who was a very interesting person, and she wrote one of the few books about what was going on.
It's a nice book.
It's a nice
about
book.
London and
and it's a very good book. The only thing is it doesn't give a full picture of what was going on, because she was close to Lambrias and a good friend of Vlachou. I think she worked for Cathy Marini. And so it gives rather a picture of conservative opponents of the junta who were doing great work, but leaves out this dimension of left-wing opposition. Although Eleni Vlachou did a great deal for the Greek cause, because she was sort of caustic and sort of attuned to talking on television and radio to a British audience. She had a sort of sharp sense of humour, and she did a lot of good stuff. And I should mention one thing when mentioning Eleni Vlachou, that I used to translate things from Greece, and particularly the nonsense put out by Papadopoulos and things. I mean, I always found his Greek extremely odd. But one day I went to see her in a little office, a kind of little Mary. She used to sit there right by Oxford Street, which was of course a kind of mecca for Greeks coming to London, and a very handy place for her to meet them. And one day I went to discuss something, an article I was writing for the Hellenic Review, I think it was called. And then she gave me a document in Greek and saying, could you translate this? It's just got it a day or two ago from Karamanlis, the exiled former Prime Minister of Greece, in Paris, and he sent it to me. And, I've looked at it and I think I'll, put an English translation in the Hellenic Review. Well, I took it, and I remember to this day sitting on the bus going from our office in Oxford Street, off Oxford Street, to the British Museum Library, as it then was. The British Library was based in the British Museum where I practically lived then. And I almost fell off my seat with excitement when I read the document, because it indicated that the man running the PR effort of the colonels in London had on his payroll a British Member of Parliament, a Labour Member of Parliament. And this report was a report that he had submitted in English, I think, originally, but then it was translated into Greek for Papadopoulos to read. And someone in Papadopoulos' office had temporarily removed it, photocopied it, sent it to Karamanlis. But neither Karamanlis nor Eleni Vlachou realized how significant it was, this idea that the PR man of the junta had this British MP on his payroll, because that introduced a new dimension to the whole story. And so I got off.
What happened?
Well, I remember running into the British Museum Library and immediately telephoning Eleni and saying, look, you can't wait 2 or 3 weeks to publish it in the Hellenic Review and no one will read it. Can I take it to the Sunday Times, because I think they'd be extremely interested in this, because it's dynamite potentially in British political terms. And she said, oh, all right then. If you read her memoir of this time, it's slightly misleading, because she claims that it was she who handed it to the Sunday Times, but it was slightly more complicated than that. But anyway, I had a good contact on the Sunday Times, and I told him what was in the report, and he immediately saw that this was, could be a very big political story in Britain. As a Labour MP, was basically working for the junta, and because the MP had been one of those that went to Greece, paid for by the colonel's PR man, and then came back saying, oh, what's the problem? I mean, everyone we met, or taxi drivers and souvenir sellers, were all very pleased with the junta. This kind of nonsense. So I said to this friend John Barry, I'll translate it for you. And by that time, Alexis de Moraes, as I've said, was in London working on his PhD thesis. So I got hold of Alexis to come and work with me on the translation to make sure there was no ambiguity at all. And so Alexis came, and we produced a version, an English version, which was so accurate that the Colonel's PR man thought we got hold of the English original of his report, which was very good news, because it meant that they were looking for the mole, as we say, who had filched the thing from Papadopoulos' desk, were looking in London instead of in Athens. But anyway, one thing led to another. The Sunday Times was originally produced a big splash about this. The PR man issued an injunction to stop them publishing, and that just increased the interest in the whole story, and eventually it came out, and the whole PR effort of the junta was torpedoed. Mm-hmm. They never they fired the PR man, and they never went down that particular avenue to try and win friends and influence people. But another thing I remember from this period was when Melina Mercouri came to attend a demonstration in Trafalgar Square against the junta, which there was a great deal of feeling in Britain and in Europe generally, opposition to the colonels, and there was a huge crowd, and she gave a marvellous speech and full of Melina-like expressions. And she was staying at the Grosvenor House Hotel, one of the most expensive hotels in London, just there for a weekend. And I think the demonstration was on a Saturday. And on Monday afternoon, George Yiannopoulos, who I mentioned earlier, who was responsible for inviting her to London, telephoned me in a panic-stricken state saying, Richard, Melina Mercouri has left the Grosvenor House Hotel and has not paid a bill, which was, I think, as I remember, £400. Doesn't sound all that much now, but it's still quite a significant amount of money even now. But in I think this was it 1968. It was a great deal of money, and we were puzzled how she ran up such a bill. But basically, I think she was telephoning all around the world. That was where the bill, long distance calls, put through a hotel switchboard where they charge you 3 times the already expensive rate. And that's how she ran up this bill. But he said, the manager of the Grosvenor House Hotels told me that unless the bill is paid by 6 o'clock this evening, I'm going to go to the papers, which would be a complete disaster. To have Melina coming and, the great heroine of the Greek resistance not paying a hotel bill. It would have been a complete disaster. So I think we chipped in at £5. I think it was a lot of money for us. And he got money for other people. And he found 1 or 2 ship owners who chipped in rather more than £5. Because by and large the ship owners were pro-colonel. Like something I put in all the books I write about Greece or about Greek politics, that they made Papadopoulos chairman for life of the Association of Greek Ship Owners. Well, that meant that when he was sitting in Coriolanus jail or whatever, he was still presumably chairman for life. I mean, you can't make someone chairman for life. But that showed that they had a very warm relation. But there were 1 or 2 ship owners who were hedging their bets, as we say. I mean, who were trying to keep some contact with opposition forces in case, eventually the colonels fell. And anyway, the money was put together, and this PR disaster was avoided. But it was a curious job. But then I was saying I had got this lectureship in modern European history at Edinburgh, which would have been, Western European history, basically. Although I was hoping to teach a bit of Greek history, because it's interesting to see something like the Greek national movement, in the context of what was going on in Western Europe at that time. But then, fortunately, just towards the end of the first year of this 2-year temporary contract and with no guarantee of a future academic post. Two jobs in my field were advertised. It was an amazing stroke of good luck. One was a lectureship in modern Greek history, and the other was a lectureship in the history of the Orthodox Church. And I applied for both. I mean, my main interest was modern Greek history, but you know, I was quite interested in the history of the Orthodox Church and had written about it, and particularly about the anti-Western kind of reaction of the Orthodox hierarchy to the ideas of the French Revolution and the Enlightenment, and also to the practice of Greeks. I remember giving each other, or giving their children, the names of ancient
Greek,
which could be the morass pinpointed, not only as general phenomena, but the year in which it began. I think it was 1807 that people were called Aspasia and Pericles and Agamemnon, and so I could have taken the job if it had been offered to me, but it wasn't. But I was offered the job in modern Greek history, which was a marvelous opportunity. I mean, it's the only job that's ever been specified as a job in modern Greek history in the British university system. Although just recently in Royal Holloway College they've got a 3-year post in modern Greek history, but that's only 3 years, not monomethesis, as we would say. So that entailed coming back to London, and I had...
That was King's College?
King's College, but it was a joint post, King's College and the School of Slavonic and East European Studies, which then was an independent institution at London University. It's now become part of University College. It did begin during the First World War as a part of King's College, and then broke off. So I was very lucky indeed to get that job. And
what did you teach when you started? What sort of courses did you decide to take?
Well, mainly courses on Balkan history, Southeast European history.
Balkan.
Yes, because Greece was too narrow.
Of course, you
had to enlarge it. But I did have a course on the movement for Greek independence. And that book I wrote on the collection of documents, some of them translated from Greek. That was, in connection with this course, because being an undergraduate course, you couldn't expect your students to be able to read Greek, although some of them, if they were Cypriots, could read Greek. But so I prepared this collection of key documents from the period
for your students,
for the students. But then I had quite a number of Greek students doing various PhDs on various aspects of Greek history, and particularly subject was of great interest to me, which is Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, particularly after the War of Independence, because I was always struck by the way in which you would have thought that, Greece seceding from the Ottoman Empire after a bloody war would spell the, death knell of the Greek community in the Ottoman Empire. That was not the case, of course, and Greeks re-established the position, a leading position they had in the Ottoman Empire before 1821. They re-established it in the 19th century. I mean, the Ottoman ambassador in London for many years was Uras Pasha, who was a great friend of Queen Victoria, and he used to take tea with her regularly. I don't know what they discussed, but and then the Ottoman ambassadors in Washington were often Greek, and Greek bankers, Zarifis, and go, re-established themselves, became bankers to the Ottoman sultans, and that carried on until the period of the First World War. So some of these people like Alexis Alexandris working on the fate of the Greek community in the Republic of Turkey, which he was well qualified to do because he was in fact a Rum. He was a Turkish national and had bilingual in Greek and Turkish, and he wrote an excellent thesis on the fate of the Greek minority after 1922, 1923, which has been rather an unhappy story. And then Victoria Solomonidis, for many years a cultural counsellor at the Greek embassy here in London, she wrote on the Greek occupation of Asia Minor between 1919 and 1922, the whole story of Sturgiadis, the Greek High Commissioner, and his efforts to bring about a relatively even-handed Greek government of the Greek occupied territories, but that didn't work out. In those early years and under the junta, it was sometimes not very easy for people if they wanted to work on the resistance during the German, Italian, Bulgarian occupation. That was politically a bit difficult to do in Greece. But now, the situation is totally transformed, and there's no need for Greek students to come and study abroad. Many of them still do, but no political taboo subjects in Greece, which there were
at the time
under the junta, of course. And this is a point I'd like to get across, that my job was funded at King's College and the School of Slavonic Studies, was funded by the Greek, not by the Greek, by the British government. They put up the money for it. They had a report into teaching of Eastern European minority subjects, and decided that these were two subjects that they wanted to have. But a few years ago I was giving a talk to the British Council about their efforts to attract Greek students to study in Britain. And then I discovered that at that time, about 10 years ago, that there were almost 30,000 Greek students studying in British universities. Almost all of them not studying Greek history or anything, but economics and business studies, other more practical things.
Yes.
But
it's a very big community.
Very big community, and that is the equivalent of two large British universities. 14,000, 15,000 students. And yet, and I, to my embarrassment, really, subsequent embarrassment, really, I, was involved in efforts to get money from the Greek government, from Greek foundations, from rich Greeks, to support modern Greek studies in Britain. It seemed to be completely anomalous. The presence of almost 30,000 Greek students in Britain brought in a significant sum of money to the British balance of payments, and they might at least have spent some of that money on some of the Greek subject. The the government or the British university system.
Professor
So,
Clogg, but you have written on the history of the Corrèze chair
yes,
and the various implications and politics around the.
Yes.
yes,
I
yes,
wonder if you would like to discuss a little bit the status of modern Greek studies
yes,
at
yes.
British universities.
And particularly that study I wrote.
That's a very interesting study.
It is an interesting study, but I discovered that, to my cost really, that writing about scandal in the history of the institution by which you're employed is not exactly
Very
a
good idea.
smart career move. I don't want to exaggerate, but at the time when I wrote that book, I had no ulterior motive. I just found these marvelous collection of papers. Papers of the kind you would never be able to get hold of these days with the internet. Everyone, King's College had 2 telephone lines at that time. You know, everything was written down.
Right.
The money for the chair was put up by rich London Greeks. During my time at King's College, I became interested in the early history of our department because the head of the department is known as the Corrèze Professor of Modern Greek and Byzantine History, Language and Literature. This was a chair founded in 1919 with money largely given by the rich Anglo-Greeks, or Inglesochiotes, they sometimes were referred to. That in itself is very interesting, the history of the Greek community in Britain, which differs in an interesting respects from other diaspora communities, because these people came rapidly acculturated into the English upper middle classes and sent their children to private schools and many of them came from Chios, which is why they named the chair after Corrèze. But anyway, this chair was established. The main impetus for the foundation came from the principal of the college, a man called Ronald Burroughs. He was a classicist, but unusually for a classicist, he was interested, even passionately interested, one could say, in modern Greek politics, and a very strong Venizelist. He actually wrote a poem once that began, this is how it began: Venizelos, Venizelos, do not fail us, and went on. And he called Venizelos my Pericles. He was a champion of Venizelos and Venizelos' vision of a greater Greece. I don't know why in English we refer to greater Greece. I mean, the Greek expression is megalia, so great Greece. And there's a difference. I mean, if we talked about Greater Britain, that would, give slightly different nuance than Great Britain. But anyway, he was a champion of the Venizelist vision of a greater Greece, and more or less offered the rich Inglesochiotes, Anglo-Greeks, Anglo-Chiots, a chair of sophisticated propaganda on behalf of Greece. He couldn't believe that anyone would ever adopt anything other than a pro-Greek, Philhellenic, pro-Venizelist viewpoint. And of course Venizelos was a very popular figure in England at the time, and he had very good relations with British politicians and things. But the impetus came from Burroughs, but the money came from rich Greeks, and also some of it from the Greek government. So the chair was established, and the first person to be appointed to it was Arnold Toynbee, then aged only about 30, very young. A quite brilliant man, but a very odd person in many respects. And also, a point I was unaware of when I wrote that book, because I only had limited access to his papers, because historian William McNeill was writing a big Fourth Reich life of him. But because I corresponded with Toynbee and had some of the last letters he ever wrote before he had this terrible stroke, and it said he was happy to lend me his papers relating to the college chair. His widow very kindly said I could see these papers, but not the rest of them until McNeill's book was finished. But he had the rather contemptuous attitude of so many classicists, British classicists, towards modern Greeks. And he particularly educated blackcoats, as he called them. I mean, you find this curious attitude sometimes that Greek peasants are salt of the earth kind of thing, but educated Greeks, rather slippery individuals, and I only learned about this. I've written about it subsequently, because I thought I should correct. Not correct. I just, hadn't mentioned the fact that he had these prejudiced views towards the Greeks. And anyway, he was appointed as a young scholar, a quite brilliant man. I mean, there's no question about that. But then he, far from championing the Greek cause, he developed a sort of emotional attachment to the Turkish cause. And this was a complete disaster, because he was appointed, I think he took up his chair in October 1919. That was, 5-6 months or so after the Greek landings in Asia Minor. And he very soon, got leave of absence to go and examine the situation in Asia Minor. Well, the Turks had the sense to keep him well away from their lines, where he would have seen some pretty unpleasant things. But, the Greek authorities in Asia Minor naturally assumed that a professor of modern Greek, Byzantine studies, would be pro-Greek, so they welcomed him with open arms and feted him, wined and dined him, allowed him to go more or less wherever he wanted. And he saw some pretty awful first-hand evidence of Greek atrocities against Turks. And, I should think, on balance, there was not much to choose between the way Greek treated Turks, over whom they had dominion, and the way Turks treated Greeks, over whom they had control. But anyway, he wrote a series of articles in the Manchester Guardian, very damaging to the Greek cause, and then wrote this fascinating book, I think perhaps the most interesting he ever wrote, The Western Question in Greece and Turkey. And
he was a war correspondent for a newspaper.
Yes, for the Manchester Guardian. Yes,
Manchester Guardian.
Yes. And so the Anglo-Heroes were furious, of course, because in a way one can sympathise with them, because they've been offered a a chair of propaganda, and they didn't get it, and a tremendous quarrel broke out between Toynbee and the London Greeks. And Toynbee, he wasn't actually fired. They wanted the university to fire him, but the university wouldn't do that on the grounds of academic freedom. He was entitled to have his own political views. They didn't fire him, but his position became untenable, and he resigned. He called it subsequently an involuntary resignation, which was an exact description of the thing, of what had occurred. But I found this amazing array of papers, Toynbee's own papers, the papers of the Greek donors. They had a Greek subscribers committee, and the papers of King's College, the papers of the University of London, and the papers of Gennadius, the Greek minister, I think he was, not ambassador at that time, minister in London, who was leading the Greeks in opposition to Toynbee. I was able to, on the basis of this, sort of reconstruct the controversy almost day by day. And I don't know whether this is true in Greece, but it's true in Britain that academic institutions are very cautious about allowing people to look at their records. And particularly among historians. I mean, we demand access to military records, medical records, tax records, every form of record you can imagine. But universities, no, they won't do this. I needed to look at the Board of Studies in History from the early 20s when the controversy was going strong. And I went to the university archive thinking, no problem, I'd be able to see the papers. But when I explained to the archivist what I wanted to see the records of the Board of Studies in History, these are records dealing with syllabuses, examination, mundane, routine, academic thing. She just sort of threw her hands up in horror. You can't see those, she said. I said, why not? They're closed for 100 years, which is unbelievable. I mean, the most secret British records.
30 years.
Well, most of them come out after 30 years. Some of them are held back for 100 years, but
not longer than.
But the notion that these mundane academic documents were closed. Anyway, they've since changed their line of access to papers. Anyway, I wrote this story. I had no other motive than to unravel a complex. I found fascinating, the kind of interface between academic politics and real politics, so to speak. But it came at a bad time because King's College was going broke at the time, and they were planning, among other things, to try and raise money from rich London Greeks. And
so they cared about the impact of your study.
yes, and I mean, some of the members of the Greek community, even many of them, found the book fascinating, but a few self-styled, leaders, made their displeasure known and said I should have, come out and denounced Toynbee as a kind of Yanitaros, a Janus.
With Formeria.
Yes, exactly. Within the same like film. And so anyway, it was. I don't regret in any way having written it. I mean, I think it makes a very good story. I mean, one or two
Fascinating.
reviewers said, you know, it's only a short book. They couldn't put it down. I mean, it was a book you could read in a long afternoon or something, and it was a kind of thriller, an academic thriller.
Very much so.
But there were other comic. The book was published just a year or two before Donald Nicol retired from the College chair, and I applied for it, but not once since the days of Dondi has anyone been appointed to the chair with interest in history or politics. It's always been Byzantinists and the most recent document, Beaton, you're going to interview.
Or literature.
Or literature.
Yeah.
Not
Not
Kaftar,
history,
Thermidor.
not
No.
sensitive
No,
issues.
no.
Yeah.
You know, because, you know, it's impossible to write about Greek history without, involving yourself in certain controversies.
Without engaging into this form of politics. Yeah.
And they wanted to, I remember Cyril Mango, who became college professor, I think in the early 1960s, he told me once that he went to see the principal of the college and said, Principal, what do you want me to do here at King's College? And the principal replied, keep your name out of the papers. That was all. Although this calculation of the university that by appointing Byzantinists they would avoid controversy didn't work out at all, because Mango himself and Romilly Jenkins, his predecessor, upset quite a number of Greek historians. I mean, and Mango is a Greek. I mean, he is literally an Englesioteutis. I mean, his family came from Chios, but then they lived in Constantinople, and it's a remarkable family. His mother was Russian, but so anyway, there was a case for me of what happened in 1988 when the College chair was put there. It was a sort of a combina by the Byzantinists. They wanted to ensure that a Byzantinist got the chair. And the whole, appointment was created with that objective view. But they didn't succeed, the combina, but again, they were not going to appoint me, so I went to Oxford, which was it was a case of Kathin Boryoliakolo. I mean, no cloud without a silver lining. I was, had a very happy time.
That's St. Anthony's.
At St. Anthony's, yes. Because Oxford and Cambridge colleges are the last sort of British academic institutions which retain sovereignty over their own affairs. If you're a fellow of college, as I was, the fellows can and sometimes do rise up and throw out whoever is in charge of the college. I mean, it happened once or twice when I was at Oxford, not in my own college, but the colleges are sovereign bodies and often have their own endowments, and which gives them a certain degree of freedom. And so I found it very nice. And again, I was lucky because precisely at this time this problem arose over the College chair in London. John Campbell, who was at that time virtually the only other British historian apart from Douglas Dakin, who was working on Greek.
Oh, Greece.
Greek, yeah. History, although Campbell was basically an anthropologist.
Yes.
But he was a remarkable man and a very good historian. But he was retiring, and he never had did have a university job, because in Oxford you have this, you're a fellow of a college, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have a university job. And he had a university job, a lectureship in Balkan history, but gave it up many years ago and was only a college fellow. Well, I, for various reasons, didn't need a university job, so I could succeed him as a fellow. And he had, most of his work was in anthropology. He had a lot of influence on his student, Koleopoulos. No,
Yes.
Koleopoulos actually wasn't a student of his, although he was very close to, people like Mark Mazar.
Campbell has a relationship with John Petropoulos, but I think yes, but in America.
Yes, and he and Dakin both. Dakin had wide interest in French and European history, but he also wrote extensively on Greek history, and I think this arose from his wartime experiences. He was stationed in the British forces in Egypt, and I think one of his jobs was liaising with I'm not quite certain about this, but liaising with the Greek Air Force units in Egypt, and that's how his interest in. This is why I wish people like Campbell and Dakin had written an account of their own lives, a memoir, which I have now written, not published yet, but.
But are you going to?
This is nice.
Yes, if I can find a publisher for it, I will, because I think, particularly as I said, given the secrecy surrounding, we all know there are scandals, and particularly over appointments. I mean, that always there are grieved people, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. Why did he or she get the chair, and not me?
Yeah.
But you hear the gossip, but the Count Paraskinia never revealed, so I reveal some of the Paraskinia. It's a very useful word, Paraskinia, which, well, the things behind the scenes, literally, but it's not the same. It's very useful having one word, Paraskinia, which conjures up a whole
All the important connotations.
Yes.
But as you said, can I say something? As you said about Campbell and Dakin, there were quite a few scholars in Greek history or literature that had involvement with Greece during the Second World War.
Yeah.
And, like Philip Sherd or
Yes,
Woodhouse.
Yes.
Greek history.
Yes. I must make reference to Woodhouse, because he is a man who obviously would have been an academic if it hadn't been for the war. I mean, he graduated, I think, in 39, 38, 39, just as the war was beginning.
Classics.
Yes, a classicist, a brilliant classicist. He got all the prizes, in Oxford, and was all set for an academic career. But then, as you know, he was parachuted into Greece, and became involved in Greece. And then he was involved curiously, he's written about this himself, in the overthrow of Mossadegh in Persia, which is really where all our problems in the Middle East started. I knew him very well, and he was not an easy person to get to know. Partly he was so clever, he felt slightly intimidated but he never showed any signs of thinking that it was perhaps not a good idea. I mean,
not to do.
Mosley, had been elected, and he wanted to get rid of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company or something. I forget what it was called. What's it that? It was, he. But you can see why. I mean, even today, any Persian will tell you that everything that goes wrong for Iran is not the Americans, it's the British, because they're pulling strings. And it's a bit like the attitude that existed in Greece. The intelligence service.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be all powerful, and but as I say, half of the British intelligence were playing tennis on the day of the coup. But one has to say that might have been a brilliant stroke to conceal what they'd be plotting. Are there any other things you would like?
Yes, about your work, some questions.
Yes.
For example, about this relation between Greece and Europe.
Yes.
I think this is a main idea of your work, the relationship between Greece and Europe,
Yes.
and the way that Greek travels, so the idea of Europe in Greece and the Greek history.
Yes, I think that's to some degree the case, but I think I'm almost more interested in the opposition to Europe in Greece, particularly on the part of the church. And what was it Christophe said? Greece is come show whatever comes from the east.
Yeah.
And I think he was right in a way. I mean, it's still a very powerful stream in Greece. It's sort of anti-European thing. I mean, at a sort of popular level, and very much tied up with religion and Pope John Paul coming and having to apologize, as he did. Was it 2002 or something? Apologize. Christophe read out a great list of all of the grievances and this is something I think which is being played out to a degree in Ukraine. There's been very little mention of it. That the Western Ukrainians are, broadly speaking, many of them Uniats, and the Eastern graduate Ukrainians are Orthodox, and we all know about the antagonism between the Unia and the Orthodox, and I think that's probably a factor in the.
Were you puzzled by this anti-Western and anti-European trend when you started working on Greece, or was it something you didn't expect?
Yes.
Were you?
Yes, I wouldn't say puzzled by it, but intrigued by it.
You were intrigued by it.
And one of the very earliest articles I wrote,
the Πατρική διδασκαλία.
Πατρική διδασκαλία, I found that absolutely fascinating. And
the political motivations.
Yes. And another thing I wrote, I don't know if it's in that list of publications, it's the kind of thing one writes as a graduate student, trying to establish, a reputation as a young Turk, which not very sensible. I wrote a long review of Runciman's The Great Church in Captivity, which, you know, this British historian Trevor Roper, he wanted Runciman to be, you know, the Regius Professor of History at Oxford. And when the Great Church of Captivity was published in about 1968, Trevor Roper praised it in the Sunday Times as a work of perfect scholarship. And what's a work of perfect scholarship? Not a single error, not a single misprint. I mean, it's ridiculous. And I wrote this piece, you know, pointing out that the book had a number of errors, but one absolutely major error when Runciman, I mean, the whole thesis of the book really is that it was the Orthodox Church that kept alive the notion of Greek identity
Yes,
during the Turco-Cartier, and that when the Epanesty broke out in 1850,
it was the church
yes,
that supported.
and that Gregorios Pemptos, Gregory V, was
The martyr.
was martyred. Yes, was martyred because he refused to condemn the insurgents. Well, there was 2 or 3 encyclicals issued by Gregory V and the Holy Synod by the Vatican, denouncing the insurgents in the strongest terms. And that's a kind of error that in a PhD thesis you would immediately tell your students to go and change that. You know? But I was amazed that I think Runciman's book was published in a Greek translation only 10 or 15 years ago, I think. And I just looked at the last 2 or 3 pages in a bookshop and see whether he corrected. No, Gregory V was hung because he would not condemn the insurgents. So they're Greek students will be, you know, getting this impression. But yes, it's this, you know, this current of thought that goes back to Byzantine times. You know, the famous, who was it? Lucas Notaras or something. You know, better the turban of the Turk than the beretta of the Khan. It was a very real.
How did you become interested in the church? Was it through the Bible Society? Because you came across the archives of the Bible Society that you started working on the. Or
it
was
was
it
more,
through
I
the
think.
churches and archaeology when you first visited
Yes, it was
the
more
place?
when I became interested in the Enlightenment.
Because at the time it was through the Enlightenment.
Yes, yes.
That's
Yes.
very interesting.
And of course, the Maras and this group of scholars knew all this in that very interesting journal. Eranistes that they wrote, you know, would produce quite a lot of them.
Right.
And I wrote an article specifically on anti-clericalism in pre-independence British. Because again, the standard British kind of, insofar as they ever wrote about Greeks under Turkish rule, they would say that the church kept alive
And the secret school.
the sort of sense of Greek identity, which to some degree was true. I mean, in educational terms and language and. I remember reading once someone teaching at, I think, one of the, was it Anatolia College or Athens College, one of the foreign schools, I think it's Cypriot, was dismissed because he was teaching his students that the Crifo Scolio was a myth,
Yes.
and he was dismissed, and one or two quite high-ranking sort of Greek, not as scholars, but people say, well, even if the Crifo Scolio didn't exist, we should still
We should
push the
invent it.
notion. Invent it.
We
Yes.
should.
and
Also, I wonder if you would like to say a few things about your work on the concise history of
Yes.
Greece.
yeah,
How you,
Plan it.
yeah,
yes.
you worked on it.
Well,
Its
yes.
main themes. Why you picked these particular themes. The visual material.
Well, first of all, having written already a short history of modern, in inverted commas, Greece, I had to make the concise history different. Because
As compared to the short history.
as compared to the short history. And one way I thought I could do that is by putting a lot of illustrations in the book. In parentheses, I might mention, have you ever seen the dust jacket, the cover of my short history of modern Greece? As I was saying, the important thing I had to do was make the concise history of Greece, published by Cambridge University Press, different from my short history of modern Greece, which were also published by Cambridge. One way I could do that would be by using a lot of illustrations. And I spent a lot of time going through photographic and archives and things of that kind in Greece. In fact, as I've grown older, I'm much more interested really in visual images than writing. Say, a good picture like that one can tell you a lot about Greece, just particularly if you explain the circumstances and there's
Around its production.
Yes, and I not only published these images, but had long explanations, drawing out all the details of them. This is quite a well-established series, the Cambridge Concise Histories. I don't know, they've got probably about 30 or 40 volumes dealing with, various countries. I don't think there's a concise history of Turkey yet, but there is one concise history of Romania now. But I think mine is probably the most heavily illustrated ones. One of the illustrations that particularly caught my eye was a picture given to me by the now retired, or now he's dead, I think, the official photographer of the Patriarchate in Istanbul. And he gave me a fantastic picture of the Athenagoras, the patriarch, walking bareheaded in a completely ruined church in 1955 in the Decembriana. So that was how I, and then I would incorporate various tables, showing lists of kings, presidents, and political parties, and population statistics and things of that kind. So it really was a different book, and as I said earlier, the key thing was to avoid the word modern concisely. Cambridge didn't put up any objections to that, but it's one of the few books written about the modern country without that
making
reference to
because that in itself tells you quite a lot about the way progonoplexia is an issue, and so much of Greece is sort of cultural propaganda. Propaganda is too strong a word, but probably of Greece is probably of the ancient world. But there's so much of interest in modern Greece, and but it's my effort to get other people to stop talking about modern Greece has been doomed to failure. I mean, I think I'm the only person that makes an issue of this.
Would you also like to say a few things about this particular area of your research that focuses on Kathimas Anatoli? How you became interested from your early years, from the beginning of your career?
Well, I think that...
Because this is quite pioneering. Very few scholars at the time worked on Ottoman Greeks. Not nowadays.
Not nowadays. Yeah. Nowadays it's really well-studied era. Yes. Yes, but I suppose I was one of the first people to, certainly outside Greece, to interest themselves in Kathimas Anatoli, which is a very evocative expression, really. You can't translate it into any other language. When I use it in an English language context, I call it the Greekies, but that's not the same as Kathimas Anatoli. It's Aries, the East according to us, or the East as we see it, something like that. It but does reflect a real aspect of Greece's heritage that Greeks are certainly not confined to this area of modern Greece now. I mean, what I find always interesting talking to Greeks is, where did your parents or grandparents come from? And so often, from Odessa or Braila or Voroiporo or something like, almost anywhere except mainland Greece. And although the first generation of Greek Americans is enormous migration to the US in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was very largely from the Peloponnese, in fact. But this, the Kathimas Anatoli, the Greeks of Kathimas Anatoli, are not really part of the diaspora. They were there, certainly the Greeks of Pontus, were there since Byzantine times, since antiquity, in fact. In places like Odessa, they were part of the diaspora because, after all, the Russians only acquired the Crimea, under Catherine the Great, and she encouraged Greeks to move there. This is the subject that I'm interested in, Kathimas Anatoli and the diaspora proper. And if I live long enough, I hope to write a book, sort of, not a history of modern Greece, but of the modern Greek, the Greeks.
The Greeks.
the Greeks.
In the modern world.
Yes, yes.
As a diaspora.
As a diaspora, but also on the stressing the Cathemata and because there's still a very large number of Rossopondi still living in Russia. I mean, quite a lot of them migrated to Greece, but
There's still a number of them.
there's still a number of them.
in Russia.
And in Abkhazia, which I have a particular interest in, there was a large Greek population there, and the head of the archives in Sukhum was a Greek.
Right.
And the way these people, well, there are two dimensions of the diaspora in Russia and the former Soviet Union. The Greeks who, by and large, tended to emigrate from Pontus to southern Russia, but then there were the emigration after the Civil War of Greeks in Tashkent and places like that. And they managed to retain a sense of Greek identity without the traditional churches that were one of the key factors that enabled the Greeks to retain a
Without the
cohesion.
religious factor.
Without the religious factor
That's
at all. And that's interesting how they did that.
So what's Greece for you?
Sorry?
This is the last question.
What is
What's
it?
Greece for you?
Greece.
Is it the diaspora, the
Yes.
cultural?
What's it? This is a Seferis.
It's the country, the Greeks.
All these books about Seferis. I shouldn't say this, but they keep referring to the wound of Greece. Was that a Seferis?
Όπου και να ταξιδέψω, you mean?
The wound. I mean, this is not I don't regard Greece as a wound.
Yes, όπου και να ταξιδέψω η Ελλάδα με πληγώνει.
Is it that's where it came from?
It is a fact.
It is Fes. It is Fes. Yes.
In 1936, I think.
Yes. I know Philip Sherrard. I think he wrote something called The Wound of Greece, quoting from Seferis.
Something like that, yes.
I don't, I just find it an endlessly fascinating society, and particularly this dimension of Greeks outside Greece.
Outside Greece.
And that possibly started, in my time in Trapezunda. I approached Greece not through Greece itself, but through Pontus, that's
From the Greek.
yes.